Under a sky smothered in ash-grey clouds, the village gathered in silence, their faces lit only by the flickering tongues of torchlight. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, damp earth, and something older, fear, primal and unshaken, crawling across the skin like an unseen hand. They said the woman had whispered to shadows, that her eyes lingered too long on the sick child who later wasted away, that her presence alone was enough to sour milk and curdle blood. These whispers had spread like fire itself, igniting suspicions until no one dared question them. And now, with the stake already set in the village square, the verdict was beyond words, beyond mercy. The villagers had come not merely to witness, but to cleanse their home of what they believed was an ancient evil. Yet hidden in the folds of the night was a truth they could not yet fathom, that the flames they kindled would not purify, but curse, and that the wrong woman's screams would echo far longer than her life. The rhythm of the night was broken by the uneven sound of wooden carts, dragging kindling through the mud. Children huddled against their mothers' skirts, too afraid to ask questions but unable to look away. The priest, wrapped in a heavy cloak that smelled faintly of incense and sweat, raised his hands as though holding the authority of heaven itself. His voice trembled with practiced righteousness, reminding the people that fire had always been God's instrument against the devil. He told them this woman, with her silence and her secrets, carried darkness that threatened them all. Every cough in the night, every strange shadow in the woods, every withering crop, he bound them together and placed them upon her shoulders. His words were not questioned, they were devoured, swallowed whole, until they became truth itself. And so the crowd, once doubtful, grew certain. The woman would burn, and with her so would their fear. But as the woman was dragged forward, bound with rough rope that bit into her flesh, the village's certainty trembled. She did not scream, not at first. She looked upon the crowd with an expression that unsettled them more than any wailing could. Her eyes, wide and glassy, reflected the firelight, but they carried no admission of guilt. Instead, they seemed to accuse. Her lips parted slightly, whispering something no one could quite hear. Some swore later that she spoke a curse, a final call to forces older than their church, while others said she merely prayed. Yet none dared step forward to stop what had already begun. The crowd had passed the point of no return. To question her guilt was to risk suspicion themselves. When the torches touched the wood, the first crackles of flame were drowned by the murmured prayers of the villagers. The priest's voice rose above them all, urging the fire higher, demanding that the devil be revealed and consumed. Sparks leapt like angry insects into the sky, and the smell of burning resin thickened the air. Soon the woman's voice broke through, ragged, piercing, filled with a terror that could shake even the most hardened. She cried out names, begged for mercy, called upon heaven, and finally, in a voice half broken, uttered words that chilled those who listened closest. Some swore she named those who betrayed her, others claimed she vowed that no harvest would grow on their cursed soil. The flames roared higher, silencing all but the cracking of wood and the slow, agonizing collapse of her body. The villagers believed it was finished. The woman was gone, the evil purged, and the night could return to silence. Yet the silence that followed was not the peace they had expected. Instead, it was heavy, suffocating, pressing against the ears like a storm about to break. The children wept quietly, unsettled not by what they had seen but by the feeling that something had been set loose, rather than bound. Even the priest faltered, his sermon fading into muttered fragments as he lowered his gaze to the smoldering ashes. The crowd dispersed, step by hesitant step, though none dared turn their backs fully on the dying emperor. Behind them, the charred stake still smoldered, standing like a monument to both faith and folly. Yet whispers rose even before the smoke cleared. Some swore they saw her shadow flicker across the ground after her body was already ash. Others said the wind carried her voice across the fields, a lingering cry that clung to the night long after the fire died. And though no one would speak it aloud, many wondered what would happen if they had been wrong. What if the woman they burned was not a witch, but merely a victim of fear? The thought coiled itself into the silence, unspoken yet undeniable, pressing into their dreams and their prayers. In their hearts they had already bound themselves to the truth. The wrong woman had burned, and the price of their certainty would not vanish with the ashes. The flames had consumed her body, but they had not consumed the story. The villagers walked home that night with smoke still in their lungs and guilt in their veins. Each step echoed with the knowledge that they had chosen fire over doubt, and in doing so, they had invited something far more terrifying than the woman they condemned. For though they believed they had rid themselves of a witch, what lingered in the dark was not relief. It was dread, and dread, unlike fire, does not die quickly. It festers, it grows, and it waits. And somewhere in the silent corners of that village, among the charred remains and the shifting shadows, it began to take root. Across Europe, the witch craze swept like a storm without mercy, tearing through towns and villages, leaving behind scars etched not only in flesh and bone, but in memory and legend. It began with whispers, stray accusations against those who stood too far outside the boundaries of what was considered ordinary. A woman who lived alone in the forest, a healer whose herbs succeeded when prayer failed, a midwife whose hands had delivered too many children alive when others perished. Fear turned these whispers into indictments, and those indictments into executions. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands, some say hundreds of thousands, were put to death in Europe, each one accused of serving the devil, of conjuring storms, of poisoning wells, of dancing naked under moonlight, while pledging allegiance to infernal powers. And while the stories vary by region, the rhythm of suspicion, accusation, trial and fire was eerily the same across borders. The roots of this hysteria dug deep into the soil of suffering. Europe was battered by plague, famine and war, each wave of disaster chipping away at faith and stability. When fields withered and children died of fever, explanations were demanded. The devil, it was said, stalked the land more boldly than ever before, and his servants walked among the people. The church thundered sermons from pulpits, warning that witches lived in their very villages, invisible but deadly. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum gave clergy and inquisitors step-by-step instructions on how to identify, torture, and convict these supposed servants of darkness. It declared that disbelief in witches was itself heresy, a dangerous claim that silenced doubt and gave firewood to hysteria. When the church spoke of hellfire, villagers saw it in their neighbor's kitchen, in the old woman's mutterings, in the illness that spread with no cure. Different regions had their own unique horrors. In the German-speaking lands where the fires burned hottest, entire towns saw waves of executions. Bamberg and Würzburg became synonymous with mass witch hunts, where nobles and children alike were dragged to the pyres. In Scotland, the North Berwick trials saw dozens tortured and executed after storms struck the seas and were blamed on witches conspiring against the king. In France, the laboured trials sent women and men alike to their deaths under accusations of Sabbaths with the devil. Even in more restrained England, trials in Pendle and later Salem in the New World would etch themselves into history, proof that paranoia knew no borders. The frenzy did not discriminate between rich or poor, though the powerless widows, beggars, and healers fell most often beneath its weight. What made the craze more terrifying was its self-feeding nature. The torture chambers created confessions, and confessions created new names. Once accused, few escaped alive. A single word under duress could unravel entire communities, as one villager accused another to ease their own agony, each name producing more trials, more flames. Fear bred more fear, and soon suspicion became the only currency of safety. To accuse was to survive. To defend was to risk the same fate. In this climate, truth was irrelevant, for the machinery of hysteria demanded bodies, demanded sacrifice to quell the unease of a world drowning in calamity. The punishments were as brutal as they were public. Women were bound and cast into rivers. The innocent, they claimed, would sink and drown. The guilty would float and live to be burned. Flesh was pricked with needles to search for the devil's mark, a patch of skin insensitive to pain. Iron boots, ropes and racks twisted confessions out of mouths that could no longer distinguish truth from desperation. And when judgment was rendered, fire was the chosen end. Fire, which consumed, purified and silenced all in equal measure. Villagers gathered in spectacle, not always with hatred, but with a grim resolve that they were protecting themselves from forces greater than they understood. And yet beneath this storm of righteousness was a darker truth. Witch hunts were as much about power as they were about piety. Accusations served vendettas, cleared land disputes, and punished those who dared to stand outside the lines of obedience. Women with knowledge of herbs threatened male-dominated medicine. Widows who inherited land stood as obstacles to greedy neighbors. In many cases, burning a witch was not merely an act of faith but a tool of control, a weapon dressed in the robes of religion. The machinery of accusation ensured that fear could be wielded as authority, binding the community not by love but by terror. The scale of death remains debated, but the weight of it cannot be overstated. Some villages lost entire families, their names blackened forever in records of heresy. Generations carried the shame of ancestors condemned, while others carried pride at having rooted out evil. This dual legacy of shame and righteousness still echoes in European folklore today. Old stories of witches with twisted faces, lurking in forests or cursing crops, were shaped not only by imagination, but by lived terror, by the memories of fire and the screams of neighbors. By the time the craze subsided in the 18th century, reason and skepticism had begun to crack the iron hold of superstition. Enlightenment thinkers condemned the hunts as barbaric, though in many rural places, fear lingered far longer. The embers of the witch trials cooled, but the stories refused to die. In hushed tones, in legends whispered by firelight, the memory of those women, and sometimes men, remained alive. And at the heart of many of these tales lay one haunting possibility. What if the wrong person had burned? The thought clawed at consciences, unsettled faith, and twisted into folklore that endured. For if the wrong woman died in fire, then justice itself had perished with her. This was the Europe that birthed the village at the center of our tale. A continent scarred by centuries of fire and fear, where the cry of witch carried a weight heavier than truth itself. When the villagers raised their torches, they did so with centuries of precedent behind them. To them, burning a witch was not only tradition but survival. And yet in that single act of certainty, in that moment when fire licked the sky, they repeated the darkest mistake of the past. They burned the wrong woman, and in doing so they summoned not salvation, but something far more terrifying. The village sat in the crook of a valley, where the forests pressed close, and the fields struggled against the soil. It was a place cut off from the larger towns, where the outside world arrived only in fragments. An occasional traveler, a priest carrying word from the bishop, or a wandering peddler offering trinkets in exchange for grain. Life was hard, and in hardship, suspicion bloomed like mold on damp walls. The villagers measured one another with careful eyes, always wary of who might carry hidden sin, who might invite misfortune by their very presence. Their houses, small and thatched, clustered around a central square where the church's stone tower loomed, casting its shadow over the market stalls and the well. Everything revolved around that tower. The bell that marked the hours of labor and prayer, the sermons that reminded them of their fragility before God, and the priest whose words carried the weight of judgment. The village was not large, perhaps 50 families in total, but within its boundaries lay a hierarchy as rigid as any city. At the top sat the elders and wealthier landholders, their fields stretching farther, their homes larger, their voices louder at gatherings. The poor lived at the edges, their cottages leaning against the woods, their survival tied to fickle harvests, and the generosity, or disdain of neighbors. The women of the village bore the weight of both work and scrutiny, a widow with no husband to shield her, a healer with herbs that worked too well, a midwife whose knowledge skirted the edges of church-sanctioned medicine. These women lived precariously. Their independence, however necessary, placed them one step closer to suspicion. In such a place, religion was not merely belief but law, binding and suffocating in equal measure. The priest's word was treated as divine decree, and the church framed every event, whether joyous or tragic, as a sign of God's favor or wrath. If the wheat grew tall, the villagers offered prayers of thanks. If the skies withheld rain, whispers of hidden sin spread quickly, for surely someone had offended heaven. Misfortune could not exist without a culprit, And in a village so small, the circle of blame was always dangerously tight. People remembered everything: the argument at the well, the quarrel over grazing land, the suspicious glance at a funeral. Old grievances festered, waiting for the right moment to ignite. The forests surrounding the village carried their own weight of unease. To the villagers, the woods were both a source of survival and a place of danger. They gathered firewood there, hunted rabbits, and cut timber for repairs, but they also whispered of things that moved between the trees at night. Old stories spoke of witches dancing beneath the moon, of spirits that twisted paths and led travelers astray, of voices that lured men deeper until they were never seen again. Whether true or not, these tales were part of the fabric of daily life, shaping how villagers viewed the world beyond their fields. Every shadow became suspect, every rustling branch a reminder that evil was not only possible but near. And so, the village lived in a tension between closeness and fear. Neighbors depended on one another for survival, sharing tools, labor, even food when famine struck, yet they also distrusted one another with an intensity sharpened by isolation. Friendships were bound by necessity, but betrayal was never far. When a cow fell ill, it was easy to believe it had been cursed. When a child wasted away, it was simpler to blame the malice of a hidden witch than the cruelty of disease. And when a woman stood too quiet at the edge of gatherings, her silence spoke louder than words. There was a rhythm to village life that made the intrusion of tragedy all the more devastating. Days were marked by labor in the fields, evenings by the glow of hearths, nights by prayers mumbled against the dark. Festivals broke the monotony: harvest celebrations, saints' days, weddings that turned the square into a rare place of joy. Yet even joy carried with it a shadow, for each celebration reminded the villagers of how fragile their happiness was, how quickly a single stroke of bad fortune could unravel it all. And when misfortune did come, as it inevitably did, it was not seen as chance, but as evidence. Somewhere among them was a transgressor, someone whose sin had opened the door to suffering. The village's isolation magnified its paranoia. Without outside voices to temper their fears, the people existed in a sealed world of echoing suspicion. Tales from other towns of witches uncovered, of curses broken, of devils defeated, fed their anxieties rather than calming them. If witches could be found elsewhere, surely they could be found here. The church encouraged this vigilance, warning that the devil sought footholds in the smallest places, in the humblest hearts, and so the villagers became their own watchmen, their own hunters of shadows, forever scanning for signs of the enemy within. It was in this crucible of fear and faith that the tragedy unfolded. The stage was already set long before the wrong woman was accused. Centuries of superstition, decades of hardship, and years of whispered stories had prepared the soil. All it needed was a spark, a sick child, a blighted harvest, a whispered rumor, and the village would ignite. In such a place, innocence offered no shield. To be different, to be alone, to be unlucky, these were crimes that could end in fire. The village was not merely the backdrop of the story, it was the instrument, sharpened by history and circumstance, that carried out the act. She was not born a witch, nor did she live as one. She was, at the beginning, simply a woman whose life unfolded on the margins of her village, both within it and somehow apart from it. Her name, now mostly lost to history and spoken in fragments of rumor, once carried no more weight than that of any farmer's wife, any mother, any healer, but isolation clung to her like a shadow, and in a world where difference was dangerous, it was enough to mark her as other. She was a widow, some say, her husband taken by fever one cruel winter, leaving her to survive on the scraps of land he had left behind. Others whisper she never married, that she had no man to anchor her in the eyes of her neighbors, no shield against suspicion. Whether widow or spinster, she lived without the protection of a patriarch, and that absence alone painted her life in strange colors. She kept to a small cottage near the edge of the woods, a place that looked humble to her but sinister to others. The forest pressed against her walls, and though she gathered herbs from its depths, villagers swore she walked with too much confidence among the twisted roots and moonlit branches. While they rushed through the woods with muttered prayers on their lips, she lingered, collecting plants with names that seemed foreign, muttering to herself as she tied bundles of rosemary, sage and wormwood to dry above her hearth. She called them remedies, the villagers called them charms. She healed coughs, eased childbirth pains, and soothed fevers, yet every cure seemed tinged with danger. When her herbs worked, it was not because of her skill, they insisted, but because of dark bargains whispered to unseen forces. When they failed, it was proof enough of her wickedness. Her appearance fed the unease. Some recalled eyes that seemed too sharp, too knowing, as though they could pierce through words into thoughts. Others swore she carried herself with a stillness that unsettled, that her silences were heavier than spoken curses. She was not ugly, but nor was she beautiful in the way the villagers celebrated. She was plain, weathered by years of labor, her skin marked by the sun, and her hair often tied back in loose strands. Yet in that ordinariness lay something uncanny. She did not fit neatly into their world of busy chatter and loud prayers. She watched, she listened, and she lived without apology for her solitude. To those bound tightly to community and conformity, this quiet defiance looked like pride, and pride was the seed of sin. Her past was filled with rumors that grew over the years into truths none dared question. She had once been seen arguing with a neighbor over a boundary stone, and not long after, his cow had withered and died. She had refused to lend grain to a beggar family one bitter winter, and their child soon took ill. A young man had spurned her sharp tongue, and weeks later he fell from a ladder and broke his leg. None of these events were connected in reality, but in the collective memory of the village, they formed a pattern. Misfortune followed her, and whether by chance or curse, she became its cause. Over time, her very name was whispered with caution, her presence avoided when possible, her gestures interpreted as threats. Children told stories about her to frighten one another, daring each other to run past her cottage at night. Men muttered about her when fields yielded poorly, and women clutched their rosaries tighter when she passed by the well. Even the priest, bound to preach of forgiveness, found himself circling her with suspicion, interpreting her independence as rebellion against the church. It did not matter that she came to services, that she bowed her head in prayer, that she gave alms when she could. What mattered was that she did not seem afraid enough of sin, of judgment, of them, and in a time when fear was the measure of faith, her composure became damning. What sealed her fate was not one great act, but an accumulation of small ones. She spoke to no one when she returned from the forest. She did not join the other women at the well to share gossip. She laughed once, during a funeral sermon, though perhaps it was only at a child's clumsy fall. She knew things about plants and fevers that seemed too precise, too unnatural. And when the harvest began to fail, when children began to cough with a sickness no prayers could cure, her life of solitude became unbearable to those around her. In their eyes, she had always been different, and difference in such a place was guilt waiting to be named. She was not without her defenders. Some villagers, grateful for the herbs that had saved their loved ones, spoke softly of her kindness, of how she had sat through the night beside the dying to ease their passing, of how she had shared what little food she had in lean times. But these voices were small, hesitant, and drowned in the rising tide of fear. To speak in her favor was to risk suspicion oneself, and so even those who owed her their lives turned their faces away when the whispers grew louder. Gratitude is fragile in the shadow of terror, and no one was willing to burn with her. When she was finally accused, her composure remained. Some said she smiled, others that she stood silent, eyes lowered, accepting what could not be changed. She did not plead wildly, did not curse her accusers in public, did not thrash against her bindings. Yet the stillness that had always marked her life was now twisted into evidence of guilt. Who but a witch would meet the fury of the village with such quiet? Who but a servant of darkness would not cry out in desperation? In truth, her silence was not the silence of guilt, but the silence of one who had lived long enough to know that her fate had already been written in the hearts of her neighbors. She was by all accounts an ordinary woman marked by extraordinary fear. A healer, a widow, a solitary figure at the edge of the village. She was the wrong woman, chosen not because of proof, but because she fit the shape of suspicion too well. She was convenient, vulnerable, and unprotected. And in the logic of the village, her death was inevitable long before the fire was ever lit. Yet in killing her they ensured that her presence would never leave them. For though her body turned to ash, her image, silent, sharp-eyed and accused, would linger in their nightmares, in their folklore, in the very soil they tilled. And as generations whispered of her, she became more than herself. She became a symbol, a warning, and a ghost who would not be silenced by flame. It began as so many tragedies do, not with certainty but with a whisper. A single misfortune cracked the fragile balance of the village, and from that fracture, suspicion spread like wildfire. The year had already been cruel. The harvest was meager, the wheat brittle and thin, and the barley heads light, as though the fields themselves had grown weary of feeding the people. Then came the sickness, creeping first into the children, an unshakable cough that rattled in their lungs, leaving them pale and feverish. Livestock faltered soon after, cows refusing to give milk, chickens laying few eggs, and sheep keeling over with no clear cause. In an age without answers, there could be only one explanation: someone had invited evil into their midst. And in the frightened silence of the village, eyes began to turn toward the woman at the edge of the woods. The first accusation was almost casual. A mother, frantic over her child's fever, muttered that the woman's herbs had worsened the sickness rather than healed it. Another villager recalled the way she had stared too long at his crops weeks earlier, and now those same crops wilted in the field. Someone else remembered hearing her mutter in the forest, her voice low and strange, as though speaking to someone unseen. One memory linked to another, weaving a chain of coincidences into a tapestry of guilt. Soon these recollections were shared in whispers at the well, murmured at the edges of the churchyard, exchanged in hurried tones as families huddled by firelight. Fear spread faster than reason could catch it. What turned suspicion into fire was not proof, but timing. A young child, the blacksmith's daughter, fell gravely ill one night, her skin hot as burning iron, her breath shallow and ragged. Her mother, desperate, claimed she had seen the woman pass their cottage just days earlier, her eyes sharp, her steps too deliberate. The connection was flimsy, but in the haze of grief, it was enough. Within hours, the blacksmith, a man whose voice carried weight in the village, stood in the square and named her aloud. His words broke the barrier of silence. Once spoken, the accusation could not be withdrawn. The wrong woman had been chosen, and the village seized upon her as both cause and cure. Accusations multiplied in a frenzy of memory and invention. A farmer insisted she had cursed his plough when it snapped in the field. A widow swore that her husband's nightmares, filled with shadows and fire, had begun after a quarrel with her. Others claimed that animals grew restless in her presence, that dogs barked at her door long into the night, that milk turned sour when she touched it. Each story, once ordinary, became sinister when laid upon the foundation of fear. The villagers were not liars, they were believers, reshaping their recollections to fit the narrative their terror demanded. To them, every failing crop, every sudden illness, every accident of fate became confirmation that she was guilty. The role of the priest cannot be overlooked. At first he counseled caution, reminding the people that God's will was mysterious, that suffering did not always require a human hand to explain it. But the pressure mounted, and soon his sermons shifted. He spoke of vigilance, of the devil's cunning, of how Satan cloaked his servants in plain sight. He reminded the villagers that Scripture itself demanded the witch not be suffered to live. His words, intended perhaps as warning, became fuel. The congregation left the church not calmed, but emboldened. If their priest spoke of hidden evil, then surely their suspicions were righteous, surely their fear was proof enough. Once named, she could not defend herself. Silence was guilt, denial was guilt, anger was guilt. Every action, every word became twisted into evidence. When she raised her hands in protest, they said it was to curse them. When she wept, they said the devil wept through her. When she stood in stony silence, they whispered that no innocent could remain so cold. She had been caught in a snare woven, not of fact but of need. The villagers needed someone to blame, someone to bear the weight of their suffering, and she, isolated and unprotected, was the perfect vessel. The spark of accusation grew into open flame when misfortune struck again. A storm broke over the valley, fierce and sudden, flattening what little crop remained standing. Lightning split the sky, striking the church steeple and sending shards of stone crashing into the square. To the villagers, it was no natural storm. It was a sign. The devil had been roused, and his servant was among them. That very night, a meeting was held. Men gathered in the blacksmith's house, their voices thick with drink and fear. They spoke not of whether she was guilty, but of how to deal with her. By the time the fire in the hearth had burned low, the decision was made. She would be accused formally, brought before them, and judged, not by God. For they believed God had already shown them the truth, but by the village itself. The morning after, whispers hardened into shouts. The woman found herself surrounded, pulled from her cottage as neighbors watched with a mixture of triumph and unease. Her house was searched, every bundle of herbs, every scrap of parchment, every tool of healing seized and displayed as proof of sorcery. Bundles of sage became devil's charms, a pot of dried roots became evidence of poison. A book of prayers, worn and stained, was dismissed as a disguise. Objects meant to heal were transformed into instruments of guilt, simply because they belonged to her. It is tempting to wonder whether any of the villagers doubted, whether anyone felt the prickle of unease as they watched her dragged into the square. Perhaps some did. Perhaps a handful of quiet hearts beat with guilt, but none spoke. To question her guilt was to risk being tied to her fate, and fear bound their tongues. It is in silence, more than in accusation, that the village sealed her doom. For once the crowd accepted her as guilty, no defense could save her. She was already condemned. The spark had ignited, and the fire of hysteria now roared too loudly to be contained. She was no longer a woman in their eyes. She was the vessel of all their misfortunes, the embodiment of every whispered story of witches and curses. Her life had become the currency with which they hoped to purchase relief from their suffering. The wrong woman had been chosen, and though no one would admit it then, some part of the village already sensed the weight of their mistake. Yet fear is stronger than doubt, and once lit, fire rarely asks for permission before it consumes. They dragged her into the square with the morning sun glaring harshly overhead, as though even the heavens themselves wished to bear witness. Her wrists were bound in coarse rope, her dress torn and muddied from the struggle, yet her posture was not broken. She stood in the circle of her accusers with her head high, a figure caught between dignity and despair. Around her the villagers pressed close, their eyes wide not only with outrage but with something more dangerous, anticipation. They had come for justice, and justice in their minds demanded spectacle. The trial of a witch was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a ritual, a performance in which every fear and superstition could be spoken aloud and laid upon the shoulders of a single victim. The priest presided, though it was the villagers themselves who demanded her condemnation. He began with the reading of scripture, his voice echoing through the square. "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." The words, sharp as a blade, were received with solemn nods and muttered prayers. Then came the accusations. One by one, neighbors stepped forward, their voices trembling with a mixture of anger and self-righteous relief. The blacksmith swore that she had cursed his daughter with a lingering fever. The widow declared that her husband's nightmares had been the fruit of the woman's malice. Farmers claimed their dying livestock bore the mark of her wicked touch. Each testimony built upon the last, a rising chorus of blame that left no space for doubt. She spoke little. When given the chance to answer, her words were drowned by jeers. She declared her innocence, insisted her herbs were medicine, her prayers sincere, her life one of solitude, not sorcery. But every denial was twisted against her. If she claimed innocence, it was because the devil had taught her to lie. If she wept, it was because demons fled her body. If she remained silent, it was the silence of guilt. The villagers had come not to hear her defense, but to confirm their own certainty. And certainty, once hardened by fear, is deaf to reason. The ordeal began with tests designed not to reveal truth, but to seal her fate. They pricked her skin with long iron needles, searching for the devil's mark, a patch that would not bleed, a place where the body felt no pain. Every wince was taken as proof that she concealed such a mark elsewhere, every bead of blood dismissed as trickery. They bound her hands and feet and lowered her into the cold water of the river. If she sank and drowned, she would be declared innocent, her soul commended to God. If she floated, it was evidence that the water rejected her, that the devil buoyed her body against its natural course. When she bobbed, thrashing, fighting against the ropes that pulled her down, the crowd gasped. The priest nodded grimly. To them, it was all the confirmation they required. Torture followed, carried out in the dimness of the blacksmith's shed, its heat and smoke choking her cries. They pressed her with questions, demanding the names of accomplices, the details of her supposed Sabbaths, the rites she had performed beneath the moon. They tightened the ropes until her skin blistered, they crushed her fingers until she screamed, they struck her until she could scarcely breathe. And yet, no names passed her lips. She confessed nothing that could ease her torment. Some said this was proof she was too far gone in the devil's grasp to betray her kind. Others, whispering later, admitted it was the silence of innocence, the endurance of one who had nothing to confess. But in that moment, her refusal became one more nail in her coffin. The spectacle of her trial consumed the village. People who once feared her now delighted in her suffering, as though each cry drove away their own terrors. Children pressed forward to see her face contorted in pain, while their mothers pulled them back with nervous hands, warning that to look too closely was to risk contamination. Men shouted for harsher measures, urging that the devil would not be expelled with gentleness. The trial became theater, a stage upon which fear and cruelty acted side by side, and the woman at its center was both the villain and the victim. The priest, though outwardly composed, revealed his doubts in subtle ways. His prayers faltered at times, his gaze lingering too long on the bruises spreading across her arms. He spoke of God's will, yet his hands shook when he signed the papers declaring her guilty. But the momentum of the mob was unstoppable. Even if he had wished to spare her, he could not. To question the verdict was to risk the same accusations that now consumed her, and so, bound by fear as tightly as the woman was bound by rope, he delivered her to her fate. Her ordeal ended not with vindication, but with condemnation, as it was always meant to. The villagers assembled once more, their decision unanimous. She was guilty of witchcraft, guilty of conspiring with the devil, guilty of bringing ruin upon them all. The sentence was death by fire. The announcement carried no shock. It was the conclusion they had anticipated from the beginning. Yet when the words were spoken aloud, a hush fell across the square. The weight of finality settled upon them, a reminder that what had begun as whispers and suspicions had now become irreversible. She was led back to her cottage one last time, not for mercy but for evidence. The villagers tore through her home, scattering her belongings across the earth. Bundles of herbs were trampled underfoot, jars of tinctures smashed, pages of prayer books flung into the mud. They found nothing that could prove her guilt, yet every object was interpreted as damning. A rosary was declared counterfeit, a crucifix labeled a disguise, a child's toy gifted long ago branded as a charm. By the time they left, her home was nothing but ruin, a hollow shell that mirrored the destruction of her life. The ordeal of the innocent had run its course. She had been tested, tortured, stripped of dignity, and condemned. The villagers, bound together in their certainty, could no longer turn back. The trial was not about truth, it was about survival. To them she was the vessel of their misfortune, and her death would be the offering that restored their world. And though the wrong woman stood before them, though every instinct of conscience should have screamed otherwise, the fire they prepared was not for justice but for fear. Her ordeal was complete, and only the flames remained. Night fell heavy upon the valley, a darkness pressed close by low clouds that smothered the stars. The village square, usually empty after sunset, stirred with grim purpose. Torches blazed against the damp air, their smoke winding upward like restless spirits. Men dragged logs and kindling into a high, ugly mound at the center, the wood stacked with a precision that spoke less of care than of determination. This was no pyre of warmth, no hearth for fellowship. It was a stage of fire, built to devour flesh and silence doubt. The villagers gathered in tight clusters, their faces carved in shadow and light, voices low and urgent. They had come not only to watch, but to participate, for in their minds this burning was their shield against the darkness that plagued them. The woman was brought forth at last, bound by thick rope, her wrists already bruised, her face pale but defiant. Her steps faltered as she was dragged across the cobblestones, yet she did not collapse. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some in awe of her silence, others in fear of what they believed to be her unholy strength. Mothers pulled their children closer, warning them not to look too long into her eyes, lest they be bewitched. Men spat at her as she passed, though their spit seemed weak in the face of her composure. To them she was no longer a woman. She was the embodiment of all they feared, and in that projection she lost every trace of her humanity. The priest stood at the foot of the pyre, his hands gripping the Bible so tightly that the leather bent and creased. He began his sermon, his voice rising above the crackling torches. He spoke of sin, of the devil's deceit, of the commandment from Scripture that no witch should live. His words rolled across the crowd like thunder, each syllable both reassurance and warning. The villagers clung to them, desperate for divine validation of what they were about to witness. Yet beneath his booming cadence, there was an undertone, a faint tremor, as though even he feared that the words he wielded might be nothing more than borrowed authority. Still, he pressed on, because silence in that moment would have been more dangerous than any lie. The woman was tied to the stake at the heart of the pyre, the ropes cut deep into her skin, pinning her arms tight against the rough wood. Her hair, unbound, fell across her shoulders in tangled waves, catching the firelight like strands of molten copper. She did not struggle. Instead, she lifted her face to the sky, her lips moving in words no one could hear. Some swore later she prayed to God for mercy, others that she invoked the devil himself, but in truth, no ear was close enough to know. The ambiguity was enough to feed the villagers' terror. Even her silence became a threat, a mystery they could not allow to exist. The signal was given. A torch was lowered into the base of the pyre, its flame licking eagerly at the dry kindling. Crackles turned to pops, smoke curled thick and acrid, and soon the fire caught with ferocity. The crowd shifted, murmurs rising, a collective breath held as the first flames climbed toward her feet. She gasped at the heat, her body jerking against the ropes, yet her cry was not the shrill wail they had expected. It was a low, guttural sound, a mixture of pain and fury, a voice that seemed to carry beyond the square, out into the night itself. The villagers recoiled, some crossing themselves, others gripping their torches tighter. As the fire grew, her screams broke free. They tore through the night, raw and piercing, clawing at every ear that heard them. The crowd, once triumphant, grew uneasy. Children wept into their mothers' skirts, men shifted their feet, and the priest raised his voice higher to drown her cries with Scripture. "The devil is leaving her," he insisted, his tone strained. "Her screams are the mark of his departure." But the villagers were not comforted, for in those screams there was something unshakable, something that sounded less like surrender and more like accusation. It was as though she cried not only in pain but in condemnation, cursing those who watched and did nothing. The flames climbed higher, wrapping her body in a crown of fire. Her skin blistered, her hair sparked and fell in blackened clumps, yet her eyes remained open, locked upon the crowd. Witnesses swore that her gaze fixed on individuals, on the blacksmith, on the widow, on the priest himself, as though etching her memory into them. A woman fainted, overcome by the heat and the horror, while others whispered frantically that the fire was unnatural, burning too brightly, too hungrily. Sparks rose into the air like a swarm of fireflies, carried by the wind across the thatched roofs. The villagers glanced upward, half afraid the flames would leap from the pyre and consume them all. At the height of her agony, her voice rose above the roar of the fire. Broken words tumbled from her lips, words the villagers strained to catch. Some claimed she named names, calling out her betrayers with her final breath. Others swore she spoke a curse, vowing that no harvest would grow, that the village would choke on its own sins, that her spirit would walk among them. Until justice was done, the accounts varied, colored by fear and guilt, but all agreed on one point. Her final words lingered long after the flames had silenced her body. The fire raged for hours, reducing flesh to ash and bone. By the time dawn began to pale the horizon, only a blackened stake remained, surrounded by a mound of glowing embers. The villagers dispersed slowly, their faces pale, their voices hushed. Some carried relief, convinced they had purged evil from their midst. Others carried dread, haunted by the memory of her screams, unsettled by the way her eyes had seemed to follow them into the night. The priest lingered longest, staring at the ashes with hollow eyes, as though waiting for a sign that never came. When he finally turned away, he did so with shoulders bowed, his Bible clutched, not with triumph, but with a heaviness he could not shake. That night, the village returned to its silence, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was heavy, suffocating, a silence in which the crackle of the pyre still echoed, in which every shadow seemed charged with meaning. The wrong woman had burned, and though the villagers told themselves they had done God's work, a seed of unease had already been planted. It would grow in whispers, in dreams, in the creak of their cottages at night, for the fire had consumed her body, but it had not consumed her presence, and in the darkness of their hearts, each villager knew the truth they dared not speak aloud. They had killed her, and in doing so they had cursed themselves. The fire had died, but its smoke clung to the village like a shroud. For days afterward, the air still carried the acrid tang of charred wood and flesh, a stench that lingered no matter how hard the wind blew. The villagers went about their work with forced determination, telling themselves that the evil had been purged, that their fields and families would soon flourish again. But beneath this thin veil of confidence, unease festered. The square, once the heart of their gatherings, now felt poisoned. Children refused to play there, their games silenced by the memory of screams. Women passed it quickly, clutching their rosaries tight. Even the men, who had stood firm as the flames consumed her, avoided looking at the blackened stake that still jutted upward like a skeletal finger, pointing accusingly to the heavens. It was then that the misfortunes began, not lessening but deepening. Crops that had struggled through the summer now withered before harvest, their stalks shriveled, their grain spoiled. The few cattle that had survived the earlier sickness began to die in the fields, their bodies swollen, eyes glassy with rot. Chickens stopped laying. Dogs grew restless, howling at shadows in the night. The children's fevers worsened, spreading now to adults, leaving families hollow-eyed and weak. The village, which had expected relief from the death of the supposed witch, found only more despair. Whispers spread quickly. They had burned the wrong woman. The first to speak it aloud was the widow whose husband had claimed nightmares brought by the accused. He too fell ill, writhing in his sleep with visions he could not describe. On his final night, he woke screaming, claiming to see her face in the corner of the room, eyes blazing, lips curled in silent accusation. When he died by morning, the widow, pale with terror, whispered to her neighbors that it was no fever that killed him but her vengeance. From then on, the village's grief twisted into dread. Every death, every sickness, every broken tool or sudden storm was no longer seen as random misfortune, but as proof of her curse. Strange occurrences multiplied. Fires sparked without cause, licking through barns and consuming winter stores of hay. Wells turned foul overnight, the water dark and bitter on the tongue. Men claimed to hear footsteps outside their doors, though no one was there when they rushed out. Women swore that milk curdled in their hands the moment they thought of her, and on certain nights, when the wind pressed hard against the cottages, villagers whispered that they could hear her voice, faint but insistent, carried on the air like a song of mourning. Some said it was a wail, others that it was laughter, but all agreed it was her. The priest, who had once led the charge against her, now found his sermons unraveling beneath the weight of his own fear. He urged the people to remain faithful, insisting that God was testing them, but even his voice carried hesitation. When the bell tower cracked during a storm, its great bell crashing to the ground in the dead of night, the villagers took it not as a test but as a sign. she had struck back against the very house of God. The priest began to avoid the square altogether, retreating into his chambers, his prayers whispered so feverishly that some wondered if he feared God less than her. By autumn, the village was consumed not by triumph, but by paranoia. Families accused one another of inviting the curse further, of carrying her vengeance into their homes. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and old quarrels resurfaced with fresh venom. If a child fell ill, the parents blamed the family next door. If a harvest failed, the farmer pointed to a rival. The community, once bound together by necessity, now fractured under the invisible weight of her absence. Where once they had gathered around the fire, now they sat in silence, watching shadows flicker on their walls. Dreams plagued the villagers too, vivid and suffocating. The blacksmith's wife swore she saw the woman standing at the foot of her bed, her face burned but her eyes untouched, glowing faintly in the darkness. Children woke screaming from nightmares of fire, unable to say whether they were memories or visions. Men who had helped build the pyre claimed to feel heat on their skin even in the dead of winter, as though the flames still licked at their flesh. These dreams did not fade with time, they grew sharper, more insistent, until sleep itself became a battleground haunted by her presence. Superstitions multiplied as the villagers sought ways to protect themselves. Charms were hung above doorways, salt scattered at thresholds, prayers muttered in desperate repetition. Some carried iron nails in their pockets, believing they warded off spirits. Others carved crosses into their walls so deeply that daylight seeped through the cracks, yet no measure seemed to work. Misfortune continued, and the sense of being watched, of being judged, never left them. It was as if the fire that consumed her had not ended her life, but released her spirit into the very air they breathed. The final confirmation came one bitter night, when a farmer claimed to see her standing at the edge of the fields. He described her form as both ash and flesh, her hair drifting like smoke, her eyes reflecting the light of the moon. She said nothing, but when he blinked, she was gone. The next morning, his crops, the last hope for the village's winter, were blackened and dead, as though frost had struck them in the night. Though the air had not yet frozen, his story spread like wildfire, and though some dismissed it as madness, most accepted it as truth. The wrong woman had been burned, and her spirit now walked among them, a curse made flesh. From that moment, the village was never the same. They carried on with their lives, for survival left no other choice, but they did so with eyes cast to the ground, their steps heavy with dread. Every shadow carried her outline, every silence her voice. The stake, though eventually removed, left a mark in the earth that never grew green again. Children were warned not to play there, told it was cursed ground, though they already knew it in their bones. And as years passed, the story of her burning became less an act of justice, and more a whispered caution, a tale mothers told to hush their children at night. Do not lie, do not wander, do not disobey, for if you do, the witch will find you. But beneath these warnings, beneath the folklore and the fear, the villagers themselves knew the truth. They had not destroyed evil, they had created it. They had burned the wrong woman, and in doing so they had unleashed something that could not be undone. Her curse was not in the withered crops, nor the cracked bell, nor even the shadows at their doors. It was in their hearts, in the guilt they carried, in the knowledge that when faced with fear, they chose fire over compassion. That truth was the heaviest curse of all, one that no prayer, no charm, no passing generation could ever truly lift. The years that followed did not bury her story, they transformed it. What had once been the tragedy of a single woman became a tapestry of whispers, legends, and nightmares passed from one generation to the next. Around every hearth, in the hushed tones of fearful mothers and the daring boasts of children, the tale of the burned woman lived on. Yet with every retelling, she changed. No longer was she merely a villager who had died in fire. She became something more, a phantom, a warning, a restless soul whose footsteps echoed beyond the grave. In death she grew larger than she had ever been in life, her presence stitched into the very fabric of the village's folklore. Children were the first keepers of her return. They dared one another to run to the blackened patch of earth where the stake had stood, to touch it before night fell, to call her name 3 times in a whisper and see if she answered. Some swore they heard her voice, faint and raspy, drifting on the wind. Others claimed to feel their skin prickle, as if unseen fingers brushed against them. The braver ones laughed, insisting it was only the wind, but even they refused to linger too long in that cursed place. For when darkness fell and the torches were lit, the laughter always turned to silence. The memory of her screams still lingered in the air, a sound that seemed to hum just beyond hearing. Soon the villagers began to tell of sightings. A woman walking through the fields at twilight, her figure wavering like smoke. A shadow moving along the tree line, vanishing when approached. A face glimpsed in a window, pale and burned, though the room inside was empty. Some spoke of hearing knocks at their doors at night, 3 slow raps, always 3, and when they opened the door, no one stood there, only the empty dark. Others swore that the smell of smoke would fill their cottages without fire, thick and choking, until they gasped awake in terror. Each story was different, but together they wove a pattern too convincing to ignore. She had returned, not in flesh but in spirit, bound to the village that had betrayed her. The church tried to silence these stories. The priest thundered from the pulpit, warning that such tales gave power to the devil. He urged the villagers to banish her from memory, to forget her name, to pray harder and resist temptation. Yet the more he forbade her, the stronger her legend grew. For the villagers could not forget. Their fear would not let them. Each failed harvest, each sudden illness, each inexplicable misfortune seemed to confirm her lingering presence. She was no longer a woman to them. She was the witch capitalized, eternal, the very embodiment of their guilt and terror. Legends began to spread beyond the village itself. Travelers carried the story to neighboring towns, where it grew wilder with each telling. Some said she had cursed the land so that no crop would grow for 100 years. Others claimed she haunted the river, dragging the unwary beneath its surface. In one version she walked the forest paths at night, her burned face hidden beneath a hood, luring children away with soft lullabies. In another she appeared in dreams, her eyes glowing red as she pressed her hands against the dreamer's chest until they woke breathless and suffocating. The details shifted with every tongue, but the heart of the tale remained the same. The villagers had burned the wrong woman, and she had never forgiven them. As generations passed, the folklore deepened. The children of those who had watched her burn grew up with her name whispered in warnings. They taught their own children never to wander alone at night, never to enter the woods without prayer, never to leave the door unlatched when the wind howled from the valley. Some families claimed their ancestors were cursed because they had betrayed her, their bloodlines marked with misfortune. Others boasted that they had been spared because they had secretly resisted her death. In this way, the village's divisions lived on through legend, each household shaping its identity around its connection or disconnection from her ghost. Paranormal signs became part of the law. The old blacksmith's descendants told of hearing hammering in the dead of night, though their forges were cold. The widow's family swore they saw her reflection in their mirrors, her eyes peering from behind their own. Farmers insisted that each autumn, on the anniversary of her burning, their fields fell silent. No birds sang, no insects stirred, as though the land itself paused in mourning. Such stories kept her alive, not as a memory, but as a constant presence the villagers could never escape. Beyond the village, the story gained the flavor of myth. Folklorists and wanderers, who collected tales of witches, found her name among their notes, though often distorted beyond recognition. To some, she became a symbol of vengeance, a spirit who rose against injustice. To others, she was a demon, a cautionary tale of what happens when the devil's servant is allowed to fester in a community. Yet even as the tale spread, the villagers knew the truth was simpler and darker. She had been no witch, no demon, no sorceress. She had been an ordinary woman, condemned by fear, killed by fire, and in that knowledge lay the deepest terror of all, that if such injustice could create a ghost, then she was theirs to carry forever. Her legend evolved with time, but it never disappeared. Even centuries later, when the pyres of Europe were long extinguished, and the Enlightenment had banished witch trials to history books, her story persisted. Locals still avoided the patch of ground where the stake once stood. Travelers still wrote of uneasy nights spent in the village, waking to the sound of distant weeping. Some claimed to see a woman at the edge of the forest, her burned face hidden by shadows, her eyes reflecting torchlight that was not there. And though scholars dismissed such accounts as superstition, the villagers themselves never laughed. For them, her presence was not folklore. It was truth, lived and felt in the marrow of their bones. Folklore is at its heart, memory sharpened by fear, and in this village, memory never dulled. Each generation inherited the same dread, the same whispered warnings, the same uneasy sense that the woman they had burned had never truly left. She walked among them still, in stories, in shadows, in silence. She was no longer only the wronged woman, she was the witch returned, the phantom of fire and vengeance, who reminded them always of what they had done. And so the villagers lived not only with the fear of her curse, but with the knowledge that it was they who had created her, born of fire, fed by guilt, immortal in their folklore. Guilt has a way of seeping into the cracks of a community, lingering in silence long after the flames have gone cold. In the village, that guilt was unspoken but ever present, a shadow woven into daily life. Outwardly, people carried on. They tilled the fields, tended the animals, mended their roofs, but beneath each task lay an unquiet conscience. No one dared say aloud what many suspected. They had condemned an innocent woman, and the weight of that choice now pressed on them with every breath. Their silence was not peace. It was a pact, a collective agreement that the truth would never be spoken, even as it rotted in their hearts. Families who had shouted loudest during the trial were the ones who avoided the subject most fiercely. The blacksmith, whose voice had carried the first open accusation, grew withdrawn, his hammer striking the anvil with an anger that seemed to burn him from within. His surviving children were told never to mention her name, never to speak of that night. Yet their dreams betrayed them. They woke screaming, their cries echoing in the small cottage until even the neighbors whispered that his household was marked. The widow who had testified against her husband's nightmares stopped attending church altogether, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Some said she feared the priest, others that she feared the woman's spirit sitting silently in the pew beside her. Generational guilt began to take root. Children, though they had been too young to understand the trial, grew up carrying the shame of their parents' actions. They were teased by neighboring villages when the story spread, called witch burners or cursed blood. Some of them defended themselves with anger, insisting that their parents had done what was necessary. Others carried the weight differently, growing quiet, ashamed, unwilling to marry beyond their village for fear the stain would follow them. Over time, surnames became markers of complicity. Families who had spoken against her carried reputations that never faded, while those who had stayed silent tried to distance themselves, claiming they had never believed the accusations. But the village was small, and memory was sharp. Everyone knew who had spoken, who had cheered, who had lifted a torch. The church records grew oddly silent on the matter, while other events were meticulously noted. The baptisms, the marriages, the deaths, the burning of the woman was given only the briefest mention, a single line noting the purging of a witch from the community. This absence of detail was itself a form of guilt, a desperate attempt to bury the past beneath the weight of routine, yet the absence made the memory sharper. People noticed the omission, and it fueled whispers all the more. The official silence only confirmed what their hearts already knew. This was not justice worth remembering, but a crime worth forgetting. The square itself became a place of unease. Though life demanded its use, market stalls, public announcements, even festivals, there was always a hesitance to linger too long. The ground where the stake had stood remained barren, a circle of earth that refused to yield grass or flower. Some claimed it was scorched by her curse, others that the soil itself carried the memory of her blood. Children were warned to stay away, though inevitably they would creep close, daring each other to stand on the spot where she had died. None lasted long. The silence there was heavier than elsewhere, pressing against their ears, quickening their steps as they ran back to safety. In private, the guilt manifested in small, almost imperceptible ways. Meals were eaten in silence where once laughter had filled the air. Arguments broke out over trivial matters, fueled by nerves stretched thin. Parents grew harsher with their children, as though discipline could scrub away the stain of their own deeds. Some families turned more fervently to religion, praying louder, fasting longer, convincing themselves that piety might cleanse what fire could not. Others withdrew entirely, abandoning the church, as if distancing themselves from God could also distance them from their crime. Either path led to the same place: restless nights, uneasy glances, an unspoken dread that never loosened its grip. The guilt did not remain confined to individuals. It infected the entire fabric of the community. Trust eroded. Neighbors who once shared tools and food now kept their doors locked, suspicious of one another. Every misfortune became a quiet accusation. Perhaps it was punishment for their role, or perhaps their neighbor's hidden sin had invited further wrath. The burning, meant to unite the village in triumph over evil, instead left them fractured, each family retreating into itself, clutching its own secrets. Where once fear had been directed outward, toward the supposed witch, it now turned inward, festering like a wound that refused to heal. And yet, despite the silence, the story endured. It was told not in confession but in whispers, in half-truths muttered to children, in warnings wrapped in folklore. Parents told their sons and daughters to obey the rules, to stay close to the hearth, to never wander into the woods alone. The witch, they said, would come for those who disobeyed. But behind the warning lay a deeper admission. They could not admit to their children that they themselves had been the monsters. Instead, they recast her as the villain, turning their crime into a cautionary tale. Still, the children grew up sensing the hollowness in these stories, the way their parents' eyes avoided the blackened earth, the way their voices cracked when they spoke of curses. The silent guilt of the village became its most enduring legacy. It shaped marriages, friendships, and rivalries for generations. It ensured that no one ever truly left the shadow of the fire. And though outsiders who passed through heard only fragments, an odd tale of a cursed village, a story of a ghostly woman in the fields, the villagers themselves knew the truth. Their lives had been bound together by the act of burning an innocent, and no amount of silence, no number of prayers could ever free them. In time, the wrong woman became more than just a ghost story. She became the conscience of the village, a silent judge whose memory lived in every corner, in every silence too heavy to bear. Her absence was presence, her silence was speech, her death was an eternal reminder that fire cannot burn away guilt, it can only brand it deeper into the soul. Centuries passed, and the smoke of the pyres dissolved into history, but the story of the village and its wronged woman did not vanish. Instead, it lingered in archives, in scraps of parish records, in the oral traditions that folklorists would one day record. When historians began to piece together the fragments, they encountered a tale not just of one burning, but of a larger pattern of hysteria, superstition, and injustice woven through Europe's past. The woman at the center of the village's tragedy became more than a ghost. She became a symbol of the thousands who met similar fates. Yet as historians sought to untangle fact from myth, the line between truth and folklore blurred. The official records offered little. In one brittle parish ledger, the entry was curt: one woman condemned for witchcraft, delivered to fire, no name, no detail. Just a line, stark and damning, preserved in ink that had outlasted her life. For scholars, this absence was both frustrating and telling. Why omit her name? Why reduce her existence to a single phrase? Some argue it was deliberate erasure, a way to bury guilt and prevent questions from lingering. Others believe it reflected the cold bureaucracy of the witch hunts, where individuality dissolved in the machinery of fear. Whatever the reason, the record's silence only deepened the mystery. Folklorists, working centuries later, uncovered far richer material. In the oral traditions of the region, the woman's story survived with uncanny detail. Peasants spoke of her as the Lady of Ashes, a spirit whose presence cursed the soil and haunted the village square. Old songs, sung in half-forgotten dialects, hinted at her screams carried by the wind. Children's rhymes warned of her knocking at doors at midnight, demanding to be let in. These fragments, collected in notebooks during the 19th and early 20th centuries, fascinated researchers. Yet they raised a troubling question: were these accounts based on a real memory of events, or had centuries of storytelling twisted tragedy into legend? Skeptics argue that much of the folklore surrounding the woman is the product of exaggeration and invention. They point to the universality of such tales across Europe. From Germany's Hexen stories to Scotland's witch ballads, villages everywhere whispered of wrongly accused women returning as vengeful spirits. In this view, the story of the burned woman was not unique but part of a larger cultural pattern, a narrative people told to grapple with guilt and misfortune. To skeptics, the spectral apparitions, the cursed soil, the unexplained illnesses, all were the inventions of frightened minds, desperate to rationalize their suffering. But even skeptics cannot dismiss the strange consistencies. Independent accounts, separated by centuries, describe the same phenomena: barren earth where the stake once stood, villagers reporting dreams of fire, travelers unnerved by the heavy silence in the square. Historians, more cautious than folklorists, stop short of calling these proof, but they acknowledge their power. Perception, one scholar noted, is its own reality. If generations believed they were cursed, then in a very real sense they were. Fear can shape behavior, influence memory, and pass down trauma as surely as any genetic inheritance. Modern psychology offers explanations. Collective guilt, it suggests, can manifest in hallucinations, nightmares, and psychosomatic illness. When an entire community believes they are haunted, they begin to experience hauntings in ways that feel tangible. The widow who swore she saw the woman's face in her cottage may have been suffering from grief and guilt-induced visions. The farmer whose crops blackened overnight may have been undone by natural blight, perceived through the lens of superstition. The villager's silence and paranoia could easily be explained as the long shadow of trauma. From this perspective, the curse was not supernatural but psychological, a scar of the human mind rather than the work of spirits. Yet despite rational explanations, unease clings to the story. Paranormal investigators who visited the site in more recent decades reported unsettling phenomena: sudden drops in temperature, faint whispers caught on recording devices, shadows moving against the grain of light. Some dismissed these as staged or exaggerated, while others swore by their authenticity. Local villagers, when asked, often refused to speak at all, or else gave evasive answers. Their silence, centuries after the burning, speaks as loudly as any folklore, for while historians dissect and skeptics dismiss, the people who live there carry a different truth, that something still lingers, whether spirit or memory, and it does not forgive. The debate between skeptics and believers reflects a larger tension in how history remembers witch trials. Were these events merely the tragic consequences of ignorance and fear, or did they leave behind something darker, something that reason cannot explain away? For every historian who frames the story as an example of mass hysteria, there is another who admits the uncanny weight of the folklore cannot be ignored. One researcher wrote, "We dismiss too quickly the possibility that trauma imprints itself not just in minds but in places. The earth remembers, even when records do not. And so the wrong woman remains suspended between fact and myth, between archive and nightmare. To skeptics, she is a ghost only of conscience, a phantom conjured by guilt. To folklorists, she is proof of the power of storytelling, how communities transmute atrocity into legend. To villagers, she is something far less abstract. She is the whisper in the night, the barren patch of ground, the eyes they feel on them when they walk alone after dark. The historians may never agree, the skeptics may never be convinced, but for those who still live in the valley, her story is not an academic question, it is a living presence, proof that fire can silence a woman's voice, but not her memory. The paradox remains unresolved. Was she only a victim of hysteria, her ghost born of guilt and carried forward through rumor? Or did her final words, half heard through smoke and agony, truly bind the village in a curse no centuries could break? The answers slip like smoke through the grasp of historians and skeptics alike. What remains certain is this: whether spirit or memory, whether curse or conscience, the wrong woman is not forgotten. Her trial and her death outlived her body, reshaped by those who tried hardest to bury it. And in that, she achieved a kind of immortality neither her accusers nor her defenders could have foreseen. The village still stands, though time has reshaped it. The thatched cottages have long since crumbled, replaced by stone houses patched and rebuilt through the centuries. Dirt paths have given way to narrow lanes of cobblestone, though they twist along the same routes worn by the feet of those who once gathered to watch a woman burn. The church still rises in the center, its tower patched where lightning once cracked it, its bell replaced but never quite carrying the same resonance. The square remains too, though travelers who pass through remark that it feels unlike other village centers, quieter, heavier, as if the very air there is weighted by something unseen. Modern life has touched the place in small ways. Electricity hums in the wires, cars pass along the distant road, tourists arrive now and then in search of quaint scenery. Yet for all its outward normalcy, the village carries an atmosphere that sets it apart. Visitors often comment that it feels older than it should, as though time here has slowed. Locals, when pressed, smile politely, but say little. They have inherited not only the land of their ancestors, but their silence. Outsiders rarely hear the story from the mouths of villagers themselves. It is told more often by historians, folklorists or paranormal enthusiasts than by those who live in the valley. Still, fragments emerge. A few elderly residents recall being told as children never to cross the square after sunset, never to step on the patch of ground where the pyre once stood. Some insist that grass still refuses to grow there, though others say this is mere exaggeration. At night, the square is often empty, even when nearby taverns are filled with laughter and drink. Those who pass through after dark report the sensation of being watched, of footsteps that echo louder than they should, of a silence so thick it feels unnatural. One visitor, writing in a travel diary in the mid-20th century, described it as a silence that swallows your thoughts and returns them as whispers not your own. Paranormal investigators have flocked to the village in recent decades, drawn by its reputation as one of Europe's lingering witch-haunted places. They bring with them cameras, audio recorders, electromagnetic sensors, and notebooks filled with stories collected from local folklore. Some leave with nothing but frustration, convinced the legend is nothing more than a collective superstition. Others, however, leave shaken. One group claimed to have recorded faint cries on their equipment during the anniversary of the burning, a woman's voice screaming a single word, "Why?" Another investigator swore she felt her throat tighten, as though rope had been tied around it while standing on the cursed patch of earth. Skeptics dismiss these accounts as tricks of suggestion, but the persistence of such stories only adds to the legend. Tourists, too, have added their voices to the lore. Some come expecting nothing more than an eerie tale, and find themselves unsettled by sudden chills, flickering lights, or strange photographs that capture misty figures near the church. Others describe dreams that follow them long after they leave, dreams of fire and of a woman's face half shrouded in smoke. A few never return, insisting that the place itself feels wrong, as though it resists being forgotten. Whether real or imagined, their experiences have cemented the village's reputation. For those who come seeking ghost stories, the village rarely disappoints, but for the locals, the story is no entertainment. It is inheritance. Many families still trace their lineages back to those who lived there during the burning, and with that ancestry comes unease. Some embrace the legend, claiming their ancestors resisted the hysteria, that they were among those who remained silent. Others carry shame, knowing their forebears shouted the loudest, threw the first stones, lit the first torches. These divisions linger quietly, never spoken aloud, but felt in the way families interact, in the grudges that span generations. The wrong woman is not only a ghost, she is a reminder of guilt that never washed away. The church too bears the burden. Though its records remain sparse, priests who have served in the parish admit privately that the place feels heavy, that prayer here is harder, as though the walls themselves resist absolution. A few have spoken of strange occurrences within its nave, candles that sputter and go out, hymns sung off-key by unseen voices, cold drafts sweeping through despite sealed windows. None will say publicly that the church is haunted, but all acknowledge that its silence is not the silence of peace. The younger generations, raised in a modern world where superstition is laughed at, approach the story with curiosity rather than fear. They read about it in school, they hear fragments whispered by grandparents, they find it on the internet described as folklore. Some dismiss it entirely, shaking their heads at the foolishness of their ancestors. Yet even they avoid the square at night, avoid stepping on the barren patch, avoid speaking her name carelessly. The legend may not command their belief, but it commands their caution. The most haunting aspect of the village today is the way the past bleeds into the present. Festivals continue, but they feel subdued compared to neighboring towns. Weddings are held, but older villagers insist on certain precautions, quiet rituals of salt and water, blessings whispered at thresholds. The harvest still comes, though when crops fail, even in the modern age of machines and fertilizers, some mutter that she is still displeased. These murmurs reveal the truth. For all their modernity, the villagers live with one foot in the past, with the fire of centuries ago still smoldering beneath their feet. To outsiders, it is a curiosity. To the villagers, it is reality. They do not debate whether the wrong woman haunts the valley. They live as though she does. Her story is etched into their identity, their traditions, their silences. When night falls and the wind howls through the narrow streets, they close their shutters not only against the cold, but against something older, something they do not name. The woman burned at the stake lives on, not as a figure of history, but as a shadow cast across every life in the village. And so the village today is both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its houses, its fields, its daily routines. Extraordinary in the way the past still pulses beneath its surface, unforgotten, unburied, unhealed. The wrong woman may have died centuries ago, but her presence remains. She is there in the silence of the square, in the guilt of families, in the prayers whispered too quickly, in the dreams that refuse to fade. The village endures, but it endures in her shadow. History has a cruel rhythm, one that repeats itself across centuries in different costumes, but with the same tragic melody. The burning of the wrong woman in that forgotten village was not an isolated event. It was a reflection of a broader truth about humanity's fear, its hunger for certainty, and its willingness to sacrifice the innocent when explanations falter. In examining her fate, we are forced to confront not only the errors of a single community, but the larger pattern of scapegoating and mob justice that stains the human story. Her death is a mirror, and in it we see not only the faces of the villagers, but our own. The lesson begins with fear. Fear is the soil in which hysteria grows, and in times of famine, plague, or war, fear demands an object. For the villagers, misfortune had no natural explanation. It required a culprit. The woman at the edge of society became that culprit because she was visible, vulnerable, and different. This is the first lesson. Societies rarely turn their suspicion on the powerful. Instead, they turn it on the marginal, the isolated, the voiceless. Her herbs, her solitude, her defiance of conformity, all became marks of guilt because they set her apart. The broader history of witch trials echoes this theme. It was not kings or bishops who burned, but widows, healers, beggars, and midwives. In scapegoating, weakness is mistaken for wickedness, and survival is purchased at the cost of compassion. Her death also illustrates the danger of collective certainty. Once the accusation had been made, once whispers turned to shouts, the machinery of the trial could not be stopped. Every denial became proof. Every silence became condemnation. The villagers did not seek truth. They sought validation for what they already believed. This is the second lesson. When fear and certainty join hands, justice becomes impossible. History is littered with moments when crowds convinced themselves of guilt before evidence was given. Witches in Salem, traitors in revolutionary France, enemies of the state in countless regimes. The pattern remains the same. Once suspicion hardens into consensus, innocence has no defense. The burning also forces us to confront the role of institutions. The church, which should have been a voice of mercy, became instead a voice of fire. The priest, bound by his own fear of losing authority, repeated scripture that justified violence, even when his conscience may have faltered. This is the third lesson. Institutions built to protect can also destroy when they align with fear instead of truth. Whether religious, political, or judicial, systems of power are not immune to hysteria. When leaders fail to resist the mob, they legitimize its cruelty, dressing barbarity in the robes of righteousness. Yet perhaps the most haunting lesson is not in the act itself, but in its aftermath. The villagers expected relief, a cleansing, but instead they inherited a curse, the weight of guilt, and the birth of legend. Their suffering did not end, it deepened, for they discovered too late that in killing the innocent, they had condemned themselves. This is the fourth lesson. Violence does not resolve fear, it feeds it. The fire that consumed her body lit a different fire in their minds, one that burned through generations. They were haunted, not only by her ghost, but by their own conscience, unable to escape the truth of what they had done. Seen in this light, the story of the wrong woman transcends its village. It becomes a parable for the dangers of mob justice in every age. In modern times, though the pyres are gone, the impulse remains. Societies still search for scapegoats when crises strike, still rush to condemn before questioning, still silence the vulnerable in the name of safety. The witch trials may belong to the past, but the psychology behind them, fear, certainty, conformity, remains alive. The lesson is not that we once burned witches, but that we still burn in other ways, reputations destroyed, lives ruined, voices silenced. Fire has taken new forms, but its essence is the same. Her death also carries a lesson about memory. Though the villagers tried to erase her with silence, her story survived in whispers, in folklore, in the unease of later generations. It teaches us that injustice, no matter how buried, has a way of surfacing. The earth remembers, the people remember, even if they do not speak of it openly. In every barren patch of ground, in every hushed voice, in every shiver of fear passed down to children, her story endured. This is the fifth lesson. Memory itself can be a form of justice, refusing to let the innocent vanish. Though they tried to reduce her to ash, she became immortal in legend, her voice carried not by her own lips, but by the conscience of the guilty. Finally, her burning reveals the cost of silence. There were surely villagers who doubted, who hesitated, who knew in their hearts she was not guilty. But silence, born of fear, condemned her as surely as the loudest accusation. This is the sixth lesson. In times of injustice, silence is complicity. The villagers who stood by and said nothing became part of the crime, and their descendants bore that weight as much as the accusers did. It is a lesson as urgent now as it was then, when fear drives a crowd toward cruelty. To remain silent is to hold the torch. The broader lesson, then, is stark but vital. The burning of the wrong woman shows us the dangers of fear, untempered by reason, of institutions corrupted by hysteria, of silence in the face of injustice. It shows us that violence against the innocent never ends with their death. It reverberates through generations, haunting not only the descendants of the accused, but also the descendants of the accusers. And it shows us that stories endure, carrying with them the truths we most wish to forget. To remember her is to resist repeating the same cycle. To forget her is to risk lighting the pyre anew. The villagers believed they were saving themselves when they lit the fire, but in truth, they were only binding themselves to a curse that never lifted. The wrong woman's burning is not just history, it is warning. It reminds us that fear can make murderers of ordinary people, that certainty can blind us to truth, and that silence can be the deadliest weapon of all. Her lesson is not confined to one valley or one century, it belongs to us all. The night of the burning has long since passed, but its echoes remain, faint yet unyielding, like embers that refuse to die. When we return to that square in memory, The scene unfolds again in the mind's eye, the flickering torches, the pyre piled high, the priest's trembling voice, and the woman's final scream swallowed by fire. The villagers believed the flames would cleanse them, that when her body turned to ash, so too would their fear. Yet the fire did not erase it inscribed. Every crackle, every wail, every plume of smoke carved itself into the bones of the village, into the soil, into the memory of all who lived to see it. And as the ashes scattered on the wind, something remained, something darker than smoke, heavier than silence. Ashes are deceptive. To the eye, they are the remains of what has been destroyed, lifeless, powerless, the soft residue of fire. But in truth, ashes are not the end. They are evidence. They are memory. They cling to skin, to clothing, to earth. They drift into the air and settle where they are least expected. The ashes of that night did not vanish. They settled into the cracks of cobblestone, into the fields that yielded barren crops, into the dreams of children who woke screaming with visions they could not explain. They carried with them the memory of the woman, a reminder that fire consumes flesh but not truth. Imagine the villagers waking the next morning. The pyre smoldered still, a column of blackened wood rising above the embers. The smell lingered, sharp and bitter, seeping into every corner of their homes. They told themselves it was over, that evil had been destroyed. Yet as they walked past the square, their eyes darted away, their steps quickened. They did not look too long at the charred stake, for fear it might look back. Some muttered prayers, others crossed themselves, but none spoke her name. They had consigned her to ash, but even in their silence, they knew the fire had not brought peace. It had left a wound that would not heal. Through the centuries, the wound remained. The ground never grew green where her body had burned. The church bell cracked. Crops failed without cause. Families quarreled. Neighbors distrusted one another, and all the while, her memory lingered in silence. The villagers carried their guilt like a second skin, passing it down generation to generation. Each tried to bury it, to deny it, to reshape the story into a warning about witches, rather than an admission of their own crime. But the truth has a way of surviving, just as ashes cling stubbornly to the earth. It cannot be brushed away, and so the story endured. In folklore, she became a figure larger than life, a phantom walking fields, a voice in the wind, a curse etched into the soil. In history, she became one among thousands, another victim of superstition and fear. In conscience, she became immortal, her silence louder than any defense she had been denied. She lived not in flesh, but in guilt, in legend, in the unease that settled like smoke across the village. To stand in the square today is to feel that unease. The world has changed: modern roads, modern houses, electricity buzzing through wires, but the weight remains. Travelers still write of silence that presses too heavily, of air that tastes of smoke though no fire burns, of shadows that linger longer than they should. Locals still lower their voices when asked about the burning, their words halting, their eyes betraying the knowledge of something they cannot dismiss. They may not call it a curse, but they live as though it were. They do not step on the barren patch. They do not speak her name carelessly. They remember, even if they pretend not to. The final lesson of her story lies in this persistence. Ashes may scatter, but they do not disappear. They remind us of what has been destroyed, and in their silent persistence, they accuse. The villagers thought fire would protect them, but instead, it bound them to her forever. They thought her death would end the fear, but instead, it immortalized it. Her ashes did not die. They became the soil of memory, the seeds of legend, the whispers that echo through time. And so we end where we began, with fire, with fear, with a woman who should not have burned. What happened that night was not justice, but tragedy. What followed was not peace, but curse. And what remains is a story that refuses to be silenced. She was the wrong woman, condemned by whispers, consumed by flames, yet preserved by memory. Her ashes never died. They live still, in the silence of a village, in the folklore of a region, in the conscience of humanity itself. The villagers tried to bury her in fire. Instead, They built her a monument of smoke and shadow that no centuries could topple. Every whisper of wind, every flicker of shadow, every shiver in the night is her voice reminding us of what happens when fear rules reason, when silence drowns compassion, when innocence burns in the name of certainty. Her story is not only theirs, it is ours. And as long as we remember, as long as the ashes remain, she will never be gone.